In the vast expanse of the American frontier, a young woman's dreams shatter at the altar. Her crime? Being pregnant and alone. As tears stream down her face, she flees the chapel, her white dress billowing in the prairie wind. But fate has different plans. A rugged cowboy rancher, weathered by years but guided by unwavering principles, finds her by the roadside. Where others see scandal, he sees strength. Where they whisper judgment, he offers shelter. On his sprawling ranch, between the rhythm of cattle drives and the glow of sunset campfires, an unexpected connection begins to bloom. She finds herself drawn to his quiet integrity, while he admires her unbreakable spirit. But can love truly heal the wounds of rejection and give both their hearts a second chance? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Matthews clutched her mud-stained wedding dress, each step taking her further from the chapel where her dreams had crumbled like autumn leaves. The Montana wind whipped her dark hair across her tear-streaked face. But she kept walking, one hand protectively curved around her barely visible pregnancy. 3 months along, just enough to show in her wedding dress, just enough to destroy everything. The memory of her former fiancé's mother's words still rang in her ears. "No son of mine will raise another man's bastard." The words had cut deeper than the icy spring wind, but not as deep as Thomas's silence. He had simply stood there, head bowed, as his family tore her world apart. She hadn't meant to deceive anyone. The letter she'd written to Thomas had explained everything, her situation, her past, her hopes for a fresh start. But the letter had arrived too late. Or perhaps he hadn't read it at all. She'd traveled 2,000 miles from Boston to Montana, territory carrying little more than hope and the child growing beneath her heart. The sound of hoofbeats pulled her from her thoughts. Sarah tensed, expecting more townspeople come to gawk at her shame. Instead, a tall man astride a sturdy bay horse approached, his face shadowed by a well-worn Stetson. He reined his horse to a stop several paces away, giving her space that spoke of respect rather than revulsion. "Ma'am," he said, his voice deep and steady as a mountain stream, "these roads ain't safe for walking, especially not in your condition." His eyes, the color of summer sage, met hers without judgment. Sarah lifted her chin, summoning what dignity remained. "I appreciate your concern, sir, but I'll manage." The man shifted in his saddle, and now she could see the silver threads in his dark hair at the temples, the laugh lines etched around his eyes. He wasn't young, perhaps 40 or so, but he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone at peace with who he was. "Name's Jake Carson. I run the Triple C Ranch about 5 miles east." He gestured toward the distant mountains. "Got a housekeeper there, Mrs. Tanner, who'd welcome the company, and there's always work for willing hands." Sarah hesitated. She had exactly $4.12 in her reticule, barely enough for a train ticket to nowhere, but pride ran deep, even now. "I wouldn't want to impose." A ghost of a smile touched Jake's weathered face. "Ma'am, in Montana territory, helping folks ain't imposing, it's surviving." He dismounted smoothly, leading his horse closer. "Mrs. Tanner made chicken and dumplings today. Be ashamed to let them go to waste." Something in his manner, not pity, but simple human kindness, broke through Sarah's carefully constructed walls. A sob escaped her throat, quickly stifled. Jake pretended not to notice, busying himself with adjusting his horse's saddle blanket. "I'm Sarah," she managed finally. "Sarah Matthews." Jake nodded, as if her name was all he needed to know. "My horse, Buck here, is steady as they come. Let me help you up, and we'll have you somewhere warm before sunset." As he helped her mount, Sarah caught sight of her reflection in a puddle by the roadside. Her wedding dress was ruined, muddy hem dragging in the dirt. Like her plans, her dreams of a respectable marriage, all destroyed. But as Jake swung up behind her, his presence solid and reassuring, she felt something she hadn't expected, a flicker of hope, small but stubborn as a prairie flower pushing through rocky soil. The rhythmic motion of the horse and the warmth of the afternoon sun began to work their magic. Sarah found herself relaxing slightly, her thoughts drifting to the strange turns life could take. This morning, she had walked down a church aisle, believing she knew her future. Now she was riding through the Montana wilderness with a stranger who had shown her more kindness in 10 minutes than her intended's family had in all their correspondence. "The Triple C's been in my family 3 generations," Jake said, breaking the comfortable silence. "My grandfather started it with 12 head of cattle and more dreams than sense. Now we run about 800 head on 20,000 acres. There was pride in his voice, but not boasting, simply stating facts. "It must be beautiful in the spring," Sarah ventured, watching a pair of hawks circle lazily overhead. "That it is. Wildflowers thick as carpet come April, and the calves kicking up their heels in the meadows." He paused, then added quietly, "It's a good place to heal if you've a mind to stay a while." Sarah closed her eyes against fresh tears, these born of gratitude rather than grief. "Thank you, Mr. Carson." "Jake," he corrected gently. "Out here, we don't stand much on ceremony." The sun was painting the mountains gold when they crested a rise, and Sarah caught her first glimpse of the Triple C Ranch. A sturdy 2-story house of weathered wood and native stone stood proudly against the backdrop of snow-capped peaks. Outbuildings, corrals, and a massive barn spread out in a practical arrangement that spoke of years of careful planning. A curl of smoke rose from the chimney, carrying the promise of warmth and perhaps, though Sarah hardly dared think it, belonging. As they approached, a plump woman with silver hair emerged onto the wide porch, wiping her hands on her apron. Her eyes widened at the sight of Sarah in her bedraggled wedding dress, but she showed no more reaction than a slight compression of her lips. "Mrs. Tanner," Jake called out, "we've got company for supper. This here's Miss Sarah Matthews. She'll be staying with us a spell." And just like that, without fanfare or fuss, Sarah found herself welcomed into a world as different from her Boston upbringing as the moon from the sun. As Mrs. Tanner clucked over her condition and bustled her inside to change into borrowed clothes, Sarah caught Jake's eye. He tipped his hat and turned to tend to his horse, but not before she saw something in his expression that made her heart skip. Not pity, not judgment, but understanding. Perhaps, she thought, as Mrs. Tanner led her upstairs, this wasn't an ending. After all, perhaps it was something else entirely, a beginning she hadn't been brave enough to pray for. Dawn broke over the Triple C Ranch with the gentle persistence of honey poured from a jar. Sarah woke to unfamiliar sounds, the distant lowing of cattle, the creak of wooden boards warming in the morning sun, and the quiet bustle of Mrs. Tanner, already at work in the kitchen below. The borrowed nightgown felt strange against her skin, but no stranger than the events that had brought her here. She found her wedding dress draped over a chair, Mrs. Tanner having worked some miracle with the mud stains, but Sarah couldn't bring herself to touch it. Instead, she donned the simple calico dress the housekeeper had provided, surprised to find it fit well enough, despite her condition. The old ranch ledger on the bedside table caught her attention. Its leather cover was worn smooth by years of handling, the pages filled with neat columns of figures and notes in different hands, 3 generations of Carson men documenting their stewardship of this land. Sarah ran her fingers over the most recent entries, recognizing Jake's strong, precise handwriting. "Breakfast's ready when you are, dear." Mrs. Tanner's voice carried up the stairs, warm as fresh bread. The kitchen was a bright, welcoming space that smelled of coffee and wood smoke. Mrs. Tanner bustled about, her silver hair neat under a white cap, while 2 ranch hands sat at the long table, their plates already empty. They stood when Sarah entered, removing their hats. "Miss Matthews, meet Pete Wilson and Miguel Herrera," Mrs. Tanner said, setting a plate of eggs and bacon before Sarah. "They've been with the Triple C longer than some of these floorboards." Pete, tall and weathered as an old fence post, offered a shy smile. Miguel's dark eyes crinkled warmly as he nodded. "Welcome to the Triple C, señorita." "Thank you," Sarah managed, touched by their simple courtesy. These men had surely heard about yesterday's events. News travelled fast in small communities, yet there was no judgment in their manner. "Boss wants to show you around after breakfast if you're feeling up to it," Pete said, reaching for his hat. "Says you might want to see how a proper ranch runs." The tour revealed the Triple C to be a carefully orchestrated operation. Jake led her through the barn, where his prized horses dozed in their stalls, past the smithy, where Miguel's teenage son Carlos was learning the farrier's trade, and into the sprawling corrals, where newly weaned calves tested their legs. "Most folks think ranching's just about cattle," Jake explained, helping her over a fence. "But it's really about reading signs, weather patterns, grass growth, animal behavior. Everything's connected out here." Sarah found herself fascinated by his quiet expertise, the way he spoke about the land as if it were a living partner in his enterprise. She noticed how the other workers responded to him, with respect untinged by fear, the easy confidence of men who knew their worth was recognized. They paused by a small creek where wild roses grew, their pink blooms defiant against the rugged landscape. "My late wife Martha planted these," Jake said softly. "Said every ranch needed something that served no purpose but beauty." It was the first time he'd mentioned his wife, and Sarah felt the weight of trust in that sharing. "She sounds like a wise woman." She was. Jake's eyes held memories, but not the bitter kind. "Died of fever 6 years ago. We had no children, something that used to trouble her greatly." He glanced at Sarah's middle, then quickly away. "Life has its own ways of working things out, I found." The rest of the morning passed in a blur of introductions and new experiences. Sarah met old Joe, the leather-faced cook who kept the ranch hands fed during roundup, and his wife Mary, who helped Mrs. Tanner with the endless laundry. Their teenage daughter Beth worked in the garden, singing softly to herself as she tended the vegetables that would see them through the winter. By noon, Sarah's head was spinning with names and faces, each person a thread in the complex tapestry of ranch life. But it was the rhythm of the place that struck her most, the steady pulse of necessary work done well, of people moving through their days with purpose and pride. "Getting overwhelmed?" Jake asked as they walked back toward the house. Sarah shook her head. "Actually, I'm feeling more grounded than I have in months." It was true. The practical nature of ranch work, the clear connection between effort and result, spoke to something in her that had always chafed against Boston society's artificial constraints. "Ranch life has a way of simplifying things," Jake agreed. "Out here, what matters is what you can do, who you can trust, and whether you keep your word. The rest is just window dressing." They reached the porch just as Mrs. Tanner rang the dinner bell. Ranch hands began appearing from various directions, washing up at the pump before filing into the cookhouse. Jake touched his hat. "Join us when you're ready. No need to rush. Mrs. Tanner always makes plenty." Sarah watched him walk away, his stride easy and confident. In just 24 hours, her world had shifted on its axis. The shame and humiliation of yesterday still ached, but it felt more distant now, less defining. Here was a place where work needed doing, where hands were valued not for their social graces, but for their willingness to contribute. Perhaps, she thought, as she smoothed her borrowed dress, that was what she'd been seeking all along. Not just a marriage, but a purpose. A place where she could build something real, something lasting, where her child could grow up knowing the value of honest work and straight dealing. The dinner bell rang again, and Sarah smiled, feeling the small life within her stir. They would take it one day at a time, she and this unexpected child, in this unexpected place. For now, that was enough. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday, carried by young Tommy Wilson, who served as the town's unofficial messenger. Sarah was helping Mrs. Tanner hang sheets on the line when she saw the boy's pinto pony kicking up dust on the road to the ranch. Her heart stumbled in her chest. Only one person would be sending her a telegram. Mrs. Tanner must have noticed her distress, because she quickly shooed Tommy toward the main house after he delivered the yellow envelope. Best to read it inside. Dear, she said gently, taking the sheets from Sarah's trembling hands. Some things weren't meant for the open air. Sarah waited until she was alone in her room before breaking the seal. The words jumped out at her like angry hornets. Miss Matthews, stop, return to Boston immediately. Stop, family reputation at stake. Stop, arrangements made for child. Stop, father insists. Stop. Her father's imperious tone carried clearly through the terse phrases. Of course he would have heard by now. Nothing traveled faster than scandal, even across 2,000 miles of American wilderness. The arrangements he mentioned sent a chill through her. She knew exactly what they meant. A discreet home for unwed mothers, where babies disappeared and young women returned to society appropriately chastened. A soft knock at the door startled her. "Come in," she called, hastily wiping her eyes. Jake stood in the doorway, his expression concerned. Tommy said the telegram seemed urgent. Bad news. Sarah managed a weak smile. My father, demanding I return to Boston. She hesitated, then added, he's made arrangements. Understanding darkened Jake's eyes. He stepped into the room, but kept his distance, respecting her space. What do you want to do? The question startled her. In Boston, no one had asked what she wanted. Her father had arranged her life, her friends had arranged her social calendar, and Thomas had arranged their marriage, until his family arranged its destruction. Sarah looked down at the telegram, then out the window where Mrs. Tanner was still hanging sheets. Beyond her, the ranch spread out like a painting. Corrals, barn, grazing cattle, and the endless Montana sky. I want to stay. Jake nodded, as if he'd expected nothing else. Then you'll stay. Won't be easy, though. Town's already talking. When aren't they? Sarah's laugh held more bitterness than she'd intended. I'm sorry. You've been so kind, and I've brought nothing but trouble to your door. Trouble? Jake's voice held a note of amusement. Miss Matthews, I've seen trouble. This is just people with too much time and too little sense. He moved to the window, watching the ranch hands at work. But you should know what you're facing. Reverend Parker's wife was in town yesterday, talking about moral corruption and bad influences. The Thompsons withdrew their daughter from helping with the church social because you might be there. Sarah's chest tightened. And Thomas's. Pemberley? The Hendersons. Jake's jaw hardened. They're making noise about their good name being dragged through the mud. Thomas himself left town the day after. Well, the day you arrived here, headed east on the morning train, according to Pete. Of course he had. Thomas had always taken the easy path, letting others handle life's unpleasantness. It was one of the things that had attracted her initially, his seemingly gentle nature. Now she recognized it for what it was. Weakness. There's something else, Jake continued, turning to face her. Some of the local ranchers are threatening to pull their business. Cattle sales, breeding contracts. They're saying they can't trust a man who harbors. He trailed off, clearly uncomfortable, repeating their words. A fallen woman, Sarah supplied quietly. A whore? You're neither of those things, Jake said sharply. And anyone who says different can take their business elsewhere. The Triple C survived the drought of '68 and the blizzard of '71. We'll survive this. His use of we didn't escape her notice. I could find work in another town, she offered. Somewhere people don't know. Running doesn't solve anything, Jake interrupted. Besides, where would you go? Every town has its gossips and judgment passes. At least here you have people in your corner. As if to prove his point, they heard Mrs. Tanner's voice raised in the yard below. I don't care if you are the Reverend's wife, Martha Parker. The girl needs kindness, not your particular brand of Christian charity. Now either help me fold these sheets or take yourself back to town. Despite everything, Sarah found herself smiling. She's quite formidable, isn't she? Mrs. Tanner. She once faced down a bear with nothing but a broom and some choice words about its ancestry. Jake's eyes crinkled at the corners. The bear decided to find breakfast elsewhere. Sarah laughed, really laughed, for the first time in days. The sound seemed to fill the room, pushing back the shadows cast by her father's telegram. Jake watched her, something soft and wondering in his expression. "You have a beautiful laugh," he said quietly, then immediately looked embarrassed. "I should check on the men. Carlos is breaking that new colt today." He was almost to the door when Sarah called after him. "Jake?" He turned, and she clutched her courage with both hands. "Thank you. Not just for the room and board, but for letting me choose." Their eyes held for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. Then Jake touched his hat brim and was gone, his boots ringing on the wooden stairs. Sarah looked down at the telegram, then slowly, deliberately, tore it into tiny pieces. She was done letting others arrange her life. The child stirred within her as if in agreement, and she placed a protective hand over her growing belly. "We'll be all right, little one," she whispered. "We're exactly where we need to be." Outside, she could hear the ranch hands calling to each other, the rhythmic pounding of Carlos working at the forge, and Mrs. Tanner still giving the Reverend's wife an earful. Life went on, no matter what telegrams might say or tongues might wag, and for the first time Sarah felt truly certain of her path. Not as a Boston socialite, not as Thomas Henderson's wife, but as herself. Sarah Matthews, who had found strength. She never knew she possessed and people who valued that strength. The afternoon sun slanted through her window, catching the torn pieces of telegram and making them glow like autumn leaves. Soon they would be nothing but memory, like the life she'd left behind. Ahead lay uncertainty, judgment and hard work, but also possibility, and that was worth any price. The first rays of sunrise found Sarah already awake, pulling on the work gloves Jake had given her the evening before. The leather was stiff, unyielding against her soft hands, but she welcomed the challenge. Like everything else at the triple, these gloves had a purpose, one she was determined to learn. "You sure about this?" Jake asked as she met him by the corral. His expression held concern, but also respect for her decision to help with the morning cattle count. "It's not exactly what you're used to." Sarah flexed her fingers in the new gloves. "I'm sure. Besides, as Mrs. Tanner says, idle hands make for busy minds, and I've had quite enough of thinking lately." Jake's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "Fair enough. We'll start you on Thunder. He's steady as they come." He whistled, and a dappled, grey gelding ambled over to the fence. He was Martha's favorite. The mention of his late wife no longer brought awkward silence. Instead, Sarah found herself wanting to know more about the woman who had helped shape this ranch, and the man before her. She rode regularly? Every day she could. Said a woman needed her own way of measuring the world. Jake helped her mount, his hands strong and careful at her waist. Thunder will remember her training. The horse did indeed prove reliable, responding to the lightest touch as they rode out to the western pasture. Pete and Miguel flanked them, while Carlos brought up the rear, the four men forming a protective square around her without making it obvious. Sarah soon lost herself in the rhythm of the work. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of sage and prairie grass. Thunder moved beneath her with smooth confidence, somehow sensing her condition and adjusting his gait accordingly. They located stray cattle, guided them back to the herd, and checked for signs of illness or injury. "You've got a good eye," Pete commented when Sarah spotted a limping heifer. "Most folks miss the subtle signs." "In Boston society, you learn to notice small details," she replied, surprising herself with the hint of humor in her voice. "Though, usually they involve who's wearing last season's bonnet or which debutante is carrying a secret flask in her reticule." The men chuckled, and Sarah felt something ease in her chest. Here, among these straightforward people and honest work, the weight of her past seemed to lighten with each passing hour. Near noon, they stopped by a creek for water. Sarah watched Jake check Thunder's hooves, his movements gentle but efficient. "Thank you for this morning," she said softly, "for letting me try." He straightened, meeting her eyes. "You're not just trying, Sarah, you're doing." The use of her first name sent a warm current through her veins. Most folks would have hidden away after what happened at the church. But you're out here, learning, working. I'm tired of hiding, she admitted. In Boston, everything was about appearances, keeping up the right ones, hiding the wrong ones. Even my letters to Thomas were carefully worded, trying to break my news gently. She stroked Thunder's velvet nose. Look where that got me. It seems to me it got you exactly where you needed to be. Jake's voice was quiet but firm. Sometimes life's hardest knocks are actually course corrections. The wisdom in his words struck her deeply. Before she could respond, Carlos called out, "A warning." A section of fence was down in the north pasture, and cattle were already streaming through the gap. What followed was a lesson in crisis management, ranch style. Jake called out clear instructions, each man knowing his role without hesitation. Even Sarah found herself contributing, helping to guide the strays back while the men repaired the fence. "Well done," Jake said as they finally headed back to the ranch, the sun low on the horizon. "You've earned those gloves today." Sarah looked down at her hands, noticed the leather beginning to soften and conform to her grip. Like her, they were adapting to this new life, finding their purpose through use rather than ornament. That evening, as she helped Mrs. Tanner prepare dinner, the older woman noticed her examining her palms. "Blisters?" she asked sympathetically. "A few," Sarah admitted, "but they feel like achievements somehow." Mrs. Tanner's eyes crinkled. "Those are the best kind of hurts, the ones that mark progress." She paused in her biscuit making. "The boss was watching you today, not just to make sure you were safe. Mind you, he was seeing you." "Mrs. Tanner, now don't get flustered. I'm just saying what these old eyes observe. Jake Carson's been alone too long, carrying memories like that ledger of his. All neat figures and no heart." She pointed her rolling pin at Sarah. "But since you arrived, he's remembering there's more to life than cattle counts and fence repairs." Sarah felt her cheeks warm. "He's been kind, that's all. Any decent man would help someone in my situation." "Decent men might offer shelter," Mrs. Tanner agreed. "But they don't look at a woman the way he looks at you when you're not watching. Like you're something precious he never expected to find." Before Sarah could formulate a response, the dinner bell rang, and the kitchen filled with hungry ranch hands. Jake came in last, pausing in the doorway to remove his hat. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and Sarah felt that same warm current from earlier flow through her. Later, lying in bed, she pressed her work-roughened palms against her growing belly. "Your world is going to be so different from what I imagined," she whispered to her child. "But maybe that's a blessing. Maybe you'll grow up knowing that worth isn't measured by social standing or family names, but by the calluses on your hands and the truth in your heart." From somewhere in the ranch came the sound of Jake's voice, giving final instructions to the night watch. Sarah smiled in the darkness, feeling more at home in this place of honest work and straightforward emotions than she ever had in Boston's. Gilded parlors. The gloves lay on her bedside table, already showing signs of wear. Tomorrow they would help her grip reins, mend fences, and build a new life. One choice, one day, one small achievement at a time. The general store's bell chimed as Sarah pushed open the door, the sound as cheerful and innocent as it had been the day she'd first arrived in town as Thomas's intended. Now, 2 weeks later, the same bell seemed to announce her shame to everyone within earshot. The busy Saturday morning crowd went silent, conversations dying like flames doused with water. Jake's steady presence beside her kept her spine straight as she walked to the counter. They needed supplies, salt, coffee, ammunition for the ranches, rifles and seeds for Mrs. Tanner's kitchen garden, simple things that shouldn't require courage to purchase. Mr. Carson, old Mr. Jenkins, nodded from behind the counter, deliberately avoiding Sarah's eyes. "Your usual order, and whatever." "Miss Matthews requires," Jake replied, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed store. A baby began to cry somewhere in the back, and its mother hurriedly rushed out, as if Sarah's condition might be catching. The town newspaper lay open on the counter, and Sarah caught sight of her own name in the society column. Her heart sank as she read the carefully worded paragraph that managed to say everything while saying nothing directly. Recent events have caused quite a stir among our more established families. One wonders what certain Eastern influences might mean for our community's moral fabric. Concerned citizens are advised to guard their young people against such unfortunate examples. That'll be all, Jenkins, Jake said firmly, laying down money for their purchases. The storekeeper's hands shook slightly as he wrapped their goods in brown paper. Jake Carson. The sharp voice came from the doorway, where Mrs. Henderson, Thomas's mother, stood like an avenging angel in her Sunday best. Have you no shame parading this person through our respectable town? Sarah felt Jake tense beside her, but before he could speak, another voice rang out. The only shame I see is grown folks acting like scared children. Mrs. Tanner pushed through the crowd, her market basket on her arm. Sarah, dear, don't forget we need more blue thread for the quilt. The simple normalcy of the request, delivered in Mrs. Tanner's matter-of-fact tone, seemed to break some of the tension. A few of the townspeople found sudden interest in the store's merchandise, turning away from the confrontation. But Mrs. Henderson wasn't finished. I suppose we shouldn't be surprised. The Carson Ranch has been going downhill since Martha passed. Now we see just how far it's fallen. The mention of his late wife might have been designed to wound, but Jake's response was measured, almost gentle. Martha would have been the first to offer Sarah shelter, Elizabeth. You knew her well enough to know that's true. Mrs. Henderson flushed. It was common knowledge that Martha Carson had been her closest friend before the fever took her. This is different. This girl brought scandal to our town, tried to trap my Thomas into raising my child, Sarah finished. Quietly, one hand resting on her growing belly, who will be raised to judge people by their actions, not their circumstances. She met Mrs. Henderson's eyes. Your son knew about my condition. I wrote to him weeks ago, told him everything. Ask him about the letter when he returns from his convenient trip east. A murmur ran through the watching crowd. Mrs. Henderson's face went pale. You dare accuse my son of... I accuse him of nothing, Sarah replied. The truth needs no accusation. It simply is. Jake's hand found the small of her back, a gesture of support that didn't go unnoticed by the onlookers. Our business here is done, he said. Mrs. Tanner, would you like a ride back to the ranch? Just let me get that thread, the housekeeper replied cheerfully, as if they were discussing nothing more dramatic than the weather. Oh, and Sarah, I saw some lovely yellow calico that would make a fine baby blanket. They left Mrs. Henderson, standing in the doorway, her carefully constructed narrative crumbling around her. Outside, the spring sunshine seemed to wash away some of the store's suffocating atmosphere. You did well in there, Jake said softly as they loaded the wagon, standing your ground without becoming bitter. Zara watched Mrs. Tanner haggle with the fabric merchant across the street, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air. It's harder to be bitter when you have people standing with you. The ranch hands want to know if you'll help with the spring branding next week, Jake said, changing the subject with characteristic sensitivity to her feelings. Pete says you've got a good eye for detail, and we could use an extra hand with the record-keeping. The simple offer of useful work, of being valued for her abilities rather than judged for her past, brought unexpected tears to her eyes. I'd like that. The drive back to the ranch was quiet, but comfortably so. Mrs. Tanner dozed in the back of the wagon, her new purchases clutched protectively in her lap. Sarah watched the town recede behind them, its judgments and whispers fading like morning. Mist in the sun. You know there'll be more days like this, Jake said finally. Small towns have long memories. And shorter sight, Mrs. Tanner added from the back, apparently not as asleep as she'd appeared. They see what's right in front of them, but miss the bigger picture. Sarah thought about the newspaper article, about Mrs. Henderson's accusations, and the silent townspeople. Maybe they need a new picture to look at, she said slowly. Not a fallen woman seeking redemption, but something else entirely. What's that? Jake asked. A woman who refuses to be shamed for choosing life and truth over convenience and lies. Sarah straightened her shoulders. A woman who's learning that sometimes you have to lose everything you thought you wanted to find what you really need. Jake's hands tightened on the reins, and though he kept his eyes on the road, his voice was rough with emotion. Sounds like a picture worth painting. Behind them, Mrs. Tanner smiled and closed her eyes again, the yellow calico for a baby blanket, ducked safely in her basket, like a promise of brighter days to come. The ranch's weather-beaten flag snapped sharply in the wind, its faded stars and stripes warning of the approaching storm. Sarah stood on the porch, watching dark clouds pile up against the mountains like God's own laundry. Her 5th month of pregnancy had brought new curves to her figure, and she absently rubbed her growing belly as she studied the threatening sky. "Gonna be a bad one," Pete said, joining her at the railing. "Barometers dropping faster than a card-sharp smile when the sheriff walks in." Jake emerged from the barn, his expression matching the gravity of the clouds above. "We need to get the herd to lower ground before this hits. That creek won't stay friendly if these clouds dump what they're carrying." The ranch exploded into activity. Sarah watched the precision of it, every person knowing their role, moving with practiced urgency. Even Mrs. Tanner had her part, packing food for the hands who would need to stay with the cattle through the night. "I want to help," Sarah said as Jake checked his saddle straps. He paused, studying her face. "It'll be dangerous. Winds already picking up, and in your condition." "I can ride Thunder," she insisted. "He knows the work, and I've been helping with the herd for weeks now." "You need every hand you can get." A crack of thunder punctuated her words, making both of them look up. The clouds had taken on a greenish tinge that spoke of serious weather to come. Jake's jaw worked as he considered. "You stay with Pete's group, well back from the creek. First sign of trouble, you head for high ground, no arguments." "Agreed." Sarah was already moving toward the stable where Thunder waited, sensing the urgency in the air. They rode out as the first fat drops of rain began to fall. The cattle were restless, scenting the storm's approach. Sarah found her position in the loose formation of riders, Thunder's sure-footed stride giving her confidence despite the deteriorating conditions. The wind rose, driving the rain sideways and carrying a hint of ice. Sarah's hands were soon numb on the reins, but she kept her focus on the cattle, helping to turn strays back toward the main herd. Her pregnancy made every movement more deliberate, but Thunder seemed to compensate, anticipating her needs with an almost uncanny awareness. "Creek's rising!" Carlos's shout barely carried over the wind. "Southeast corner's already flooding!" Jake's voice cut through the storm like a whip crack. "Pete, take your group in the eastern half. Miguel, west side. Keep them moving toward the ridge." Sarah could see the creek now, its usually placid surface transformed into a churning brown monster. The rain was coming down in sheets, and somewhere, in the darkness, lightning split the sky with brilliant fingers. A cow and her calf strayed too close to the creek bank. Without thinking, Sarah urged Thunder forward. The ground was treacherous, mud sucking at the horses' hooves, but together they managed to turn the pair back toward safety. "Sarah!" Jake's voice held equal parts anger and fear. "I said stay back. They would have been lost," she called back, rain streaming down her face. Thunder picked his way carefully back from the creek's edge, which was crumbling now under the force of the rising water. Suddenly, the sound of splintering wood cut through the storm's roar. A section of old fence, torn loose by the flood, was careening downstream like a battering ram. It slammed into the creek bank where Sarah had been moments before, taking a huge chunk of earth with it. "Move! Move!" Jake's shout galvanized everyone into action. The herd, already spooked by the storm, began to stampede toward higher ground. Sarah found herself caught in the flow, Thunder fighting to maintain his footing in the chaos. Through the rain and darkness, she caught glimpses of the other riders. Pete's distinctive silhouette, Miguel's red bandana, Carlos's younger form leaning low over his horse's neck. And always, Jake's commanding presence, somehow managing to be everywhere at once, directing, supporting, protecting. Hours seemed to pass in a blur of rain and thunder, muscle-straining work and heart-pounding moments. Sarah's world narrowed to the rhythm of thunder's movement beneath her, the sound of hooves and cattle, and the constant drum of rain on her slicker. Finally, gradually, she became aware that they were ascending. The ridge rose before them, offering safety from the flooding creek below. The cattle, exhausted and waterlogged, began to settle as they reached level ground. "Everyone account for," Jake's voice carried across the ridge. One by one, the hands called out their presence. Sarah added her own voice to the chorus, hearing the relief in Jake's acknowledgement. It wasn't until they had the herd settled that Jake rode up beside her. In the occasional flashes of lightning, she could see the worry and anger warring on his face. "You could have been killed," he said quietly. "So could any of us," she replied, pushing wet hair from her face. "That's not a reason not to help. When help's needed." "Sarah!" He stopped, seeming to struggle with words. Finally, he reached across the space between their horses and took her hand. His grip was strong, almost desperate. "I can't lose. I can't have anyone else lost on my watch." The unspoken emotion in his voice made her breath catch. "Jake, But whatever she might have said was interrupted by Pete's approach. "Boss, we got the count. Lost maybe a dozen head, but it could have been much worse." Jake released her hand, but something had changed between them. The storm's fury had stripped away another layer of pretense, leaving raw truth exposed like bedrock after a flood. They spent the night on the ridge, the hands taking turns watching the herd while others tried to rest under hastily rigged tarps. Sarah found herself sharing shelter with Mrs. Tanner, who had ridden out with supplies as soon as the worst of the storm passed. "Saw the way he looked at you," the older woman said softly, passing Sarah a cup of hot coffee when you were near. "That creek, like his whole world was about to be washed away." Sarah wrapped her cold hands around the cup, feeling her child move within her. "I'm not Martha," she said quietly. "No," Mrs. Tanner agreed. "You're something else entirely. Maybe that's exactly what he needs." The storm gradually moved east, leaving behind a landscape transformed by its power. As dawn broke, Sarah stood with Jake at the ridge's edge, surveying the damage below. The creek had carved new channels, fences were down, and debris littered the valley floor. "It'll take weeks to put right," Jake said. Sarah looked at him, saw the strength and worry etched in his profile. "Good thing you have help, then." His eyes met hers, and in them she saw not just the reflection of the rising sun, but a future as vast and promising as the Montana sky itself. The cleanup after the storm revealed more than just damage. While helping Jake sort through waterlogged papers in his office, Sarah discovered an old family Bible, its leather cover worn smooth by generations of hands. It had been tucked away, in a bottom drawer, preserved from the flood by nothing more than luck and sturdy craftsmanship. "I haven't seen this in years," Jake said softly, taking the Bible from her with gentle hands. "Martha used to read from it every Sunday morning." Sarah watched as he opened it carefully, his fingers tracing the familiar pages. Between them, pressed and preserved, were dried flowers. Martha's wedding bouquet, she guessed. But it was the family record pages that caught her attention. Names and dates recorded in different hands told the story of the Carson family, including one entry that made her heart ache. "Infant son Carson, born and died June 15th, 1869. Jake saw where her eyes had fallen. "That was our only child," he said quietly. "He lived less than an hour. Martha was never able to carry another to term after that." Understanding bloomed in Sarah's heart. That's why she planted the roses, something that would grow and bloom, despite everything. "Yes," Jake's voice was rough with emotion. "She said every ranch needed hope, even if it came with thorns." He looked at Sarah's rounded belly, then quickly away. "I should have told you sooner about all of it." Sarah rested her hand on his arm. "We all have stories we keep close, Jake, things too precious or painful to share easily. Like the father of your child." His question was gentle, without judgment. Sarah moved to the window, watching the ranch hands repair fencing in the distance. His name was William. He was a teacher at the ladies' seminary where I studied music. He spoke of poetry and passion, of breaking free from society's constraints. She smiled sadly. When I told him about the baby, he revealed he already had a wife and children in Connecticut. He offered money for a solution. But you chose differently, Jake said. I chose life, Sarah replied simply, even knowing it would mean scandal, rejection, the loss of everything I'd been raised to value. My father called it willful pride. Maybe he was right. Jake moved to stand beside her at the window. Sounds more like courage to me. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the distant sound of hammering and the occasional lowing of cattle. The Bible lay open on Jake's desk, its pages containing both sorrow and hope, much like their own hearts. The ranch is struggling, isn't it? Sarah asked finally, remembering the water-damaged ledges they'd been sorting. Even before the storm? Jake didn't deny it. Some of the local ranchers made good on their threats after you came. Cancelled contracts, took their business elsewhere. The storm damage won't help matters. Because of me. Sarah's voice held more anger than guilt. Because they'd rather destroy a man's livelihood than accept someone who doesn't fit their narrow view of propriety. They're not destroying anything, Jake said firmly. The Triple C survived my grandfather's gambling debts, my father's poor investments, and every natural disaster Montana could throw at us. We'll survive this too. Sarah turned to face him. Let me help. I know bookkeeping, accounting, in Boston. You don't owe me anything, Sarah. This isn't about debt, she said, softly. It's about building something together. The word hung between them. Full of meaning, neither was quite ready to voice. Jake's hands clenched at his sides, as if fighting the urge to reach for her. A knock at the door broke the moment. Carlos stood there, looking apologetic. Boss, that bay mare's having trouble with her foaling. Pete thinks we might need the vet. Jake straightened, duty calling him back to the ranch's immediate needs. I'll be right there, he turned to Sarah. We'll finish this conversation later. She nodded, aware of all the things still unsaid between them. As Jake left with Carlos, Sarah looked down at the family Bible, still open to the record pages. Below the entry for Jake's lost son, there was space for new names, new life, new beginnings. Mrs. Tanner found her there a while later, carefully repairing torn pages with archive tape she'd found in Jake's desk. Some things are worth mending, the housekeeper said, watching Sarah's gentle work with knowing eyes. Yes, Sarah agreed, thinking of more than just the Bible's fragile pages. Some things are. She spent the rest of the afternoon organizing the office, creating order from the storm's chaos. The ledgers told their own story of careful management and honest work, of a man who valued substance over show. Between the columns of figures, she could read Jake's character as clearly as any novel. When evening came, she found him in the barn, checking on the bay mare and her new foal. Both had survived, against the odds. Like you said, Sarah observed, watching the wobbly-legged foal nurse, life has its own ways of working things out. Jake looked at her in the lantern light, his eyes full of something that made her heart beat faster. Sarah, about earlier. We don't have to talk about it now, she said quickly. There's time. Yes, he agreed, his voice soft but certain. There's time. Behind them the mare nickered softly to her foal, a sound of comfort and belonging. Outside, the repaired weather vane creaked as it turned, testing which way the wind would blow next across the Montana plains. And in the growing darkness, two hearts beat with the rhythm of possibility, of hope, as sturdy as an old family Bible, and as fragile as new life taking its first steps. The legal notice arrived with the morning mail, its official seal gleaming like a bad omen in the summer sun. Sarah recognized Thomas's family lawyer's letterhead before she even broke the seal. Inside, formal language barely masked the threat. Beneath, demands rectification of reputation damage, claims of prior knowledge false and slanderous, immediate cessation of all accusations, legal action to be pursued if compliance is not met. She was still staring at the paper when the sound of approaching horses drew her attention. Through the window, she saw Thomas himself riding up to the ranch house, flanked by two men she didn't recognize. Jake was already moving to the door, his expression stormy. "Stay inside," he told her quietly. "No." Sarah folded the notice carefully and tucked it into her pocket. "Whatever's coming, we face it together." Thomas looked different, harder somehow, his boyish charm replaced by something calculating. His eyes fixed on Sarah's obviously pregnant form, and his lip curled slightly. "I've come to set things right," he announced, loud enough for the ranch. Hands gathering nearby to hear, to correct certain misunderstandings. "The only misunderstanding," Sarah replied calmly, "is thinking I would retract the truth to save your reputation." "The truth?" Thomas laughed sharply. "The truth is, you're trying to trap an innocent man into taking responsibility for your indiscretion. I never received any letter. You arrived here with your condition already established, trying to force my hand." Jake stepped forward, his voice dangerously quiet. "I suggest you leave, Mr. Henderson. Now." "Or what, Carson? You'll add assault to the list of charges?" Thomas pulled another document from his coat. "I have here sworn statements from respected citizens about the moral character of your ranch since taking in this woman, about contracts cancelled, business lost. How long can you stay afloat, I wonder?" Sarah felt sick, not from her pregnancy, but from seeing the true nature of the man she'd once agreed to marry. "Your mother knew," she said clearly. "Ask her about the letter, Thomas. Ask her why she really insisted on moving up the wedding date." Color drained from Thomas's face. One of his companions shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "You're going to withdraw your claims," Thomas said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "Sign a statement admitting you lied or nothing." Jake's hand found Sarah's, their fingers intertwining. "This is my ranch, Henderson. You're not welcome here." The touch of Jake's hand, warm and strong against hers, gave Sarah courage she didn't know she possessed. "I chose truth over convenience once before, Thomas. I'd do it again. Now get off this property before I ask these men." "Here." She gestured to the ranch hands who had moved closer, their faces grim, "to show you the way." For a moment, Thomas's facade cracked, showing the coward beneath. Then he yanked his horse's head around. "You'll be hearing from my lawyers," he spat. "And you'll be hearing from mine," Jake replied evenly. "I'm sure they'd be very interested in discussing business interference and slander." They watched the three men ride away, dust rising behind them like the last vestiges of Sarah's old life disappearing into the summer haze. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Your ranch shouldn't have to suffer for my choices." Jake turned to her, his eyes fierce with conviction. "This ranch has never been stronger than since you arrived. Whatever comes, we'll face it like we faced that storm together." Looking up at him, Sarah realized that somehow, without her noticing, this weathered rancher with his quiet strength and unwavering principles had become as necessary to her as breathing. And maybe, just maybe, she had become the same to him. Sarah sat at Jake's desk late that night, writing by lamplight. Her letter to Mrs. Henderson flowed from her pen with surprising ease. "I know you read my letter to Thomas. I remember your hands trembling when you handed me that cup of tea the day I arrived. How you couldn't meet my eyes. A mother knows her son's weaknesses, doesn't she? Just as she would do anything to protect him from consequences." A sharp pain in her abdomen made her pause, hand pressed to her side. The baby had been restless all evening, perhaps sensing her distress. Another pain followed, stronger this time. "Sarah," Jake's voice came from the doorway, "you should be resting." "I needed to." She tried to stand but swayed as another pain gripped her. "Something's wrong." Jake crossed the room in 3 strides, catching her as her knees buckled. "Pete," he shouted, "saddle up! We need the doctor." The next hours passed in a blur of pain and fear. Sarah was vaguely aware of being lifted into the wagon, of Jake's strong arms holding her steady over the rough road to town. She heard Mrs. Tanner's voice praying, felt cool cloths on her forehead. "Too early," she whispered. "It's too early. Just hold on," Jake murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "Both of you, hold on." The town doctor's house was dark when they arrived, but lights soon blazed. Dr. Wilson, still buttoning his shirt, took one look at Sarah and began barking orders. "Get her inside. Mary, we need hot water and clean linens, now." Sarah clutched Jake's hand as another contraction seized her. "Don't leave." "Never," he promised, then looked to the doctor for permission. Dr. Wilson nodded grimly. "Stay. She needs all the strength she can get." Through the haze of pain, Sarah heard the doctor explaining something about stress, about the body's response to emotional trauma. Words like preterm labor and complications floated around her. "Fight, Sarah," Jake's voice anchored her to consciousness. "You're the strongest person I know. Fight." Hours passed. Dawn began to paint the sky when Dr. Wilson finally smiled. "The contractions are slowing. With complete bed rest, we might be able to hold off labor for a few more weeks." The relief in the room was palpable. Mrs. Tanner burst into tears, and Pete, who'd been pacing outside, let out a whoop that probably woke half the town. Jake hadn't released Sarah's hand through any of it. Now he pressed his lips to her fingers, a gesture so tender it brought fresh tears to her eyes. "I thought," he started, then had to clear his throat. "I thought I was going to lose you both." Sarah touched his cheek, feeling the stubble of a sleepless night. "You won't lose us." "But Jake, we need to make some decisions." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "About Thomas, about the ranch. I won't back down from the truth," she said firmly. "But maybe there's another way. A way that doesn't risk everything you've built. Everything we're building," he corrected. "And we'll find it together." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a creased envelope. "This came yesterday. I was waiting for the right time to show you." Inside was a letter from a prominent cattle buyer in Oregon. "Heard about your situation. Appreciate a man who stands by his principles. Interested in discussing exclusive contracts." Sarah read it twice, hope blooming in her chest. "This could save the ranch." "The ranch doesn't need saving," Jake said softly. "It just needs the right people caring for it. The right family." The word family hung in the air between them, full of promise and possibility. Outside, the sun rose over the town that had tried to shame her, painting everything in the forgiving light of a new day. The ranch's land deed lay spread across Jake's desk, its yellowed edges curling slightly in the summer heat. Sarah studied the document, her fingers tracing the careful script that had transferred 20,000 acres from Jake's grandfather to his father, and finally to Jake himself. "The Henderson lawyers are claiming the creek boundary was never properly surveyed," Pete reported, his hat twisted anxiously in his hands. "They're saying a good portion of our north grazing land rightfully belongs to their client." Jake's jaw tightened. "Land that's been Carson property for 3 generations. Land that suddenly becomes disputed the moment Thomas returns." "It's not about the land," Sarah said quietly, one hand resting on her now stabilized pregnancy. 2 weeks of enforced bed rest had given her plenty of time to think. "It's about control, about making us bend." Mrs. Tanner snorted from her position by the window. "Then they don't know this family very well, do they?" Family. The word wrapped around Sarah like a warm blanket. Somewhere in these past months, the Triple C's people had become more family to her than her own flesh and blood back in Boston. "The Oregon contract?" Jake asked, turning to Miguel, who handled most of their business correspondence. "Signed and registered," Miguel confirmed. "They're willing to pay premium prices, boss. Say they like dealing with ranchers who have principles." Sarah watched Jake's face, saw the weight of responsibility there. "But it won't help if we lose the north pastures," she said, understanding. "We need that grazing land to maintain the herd size the contract requires." "Got it in one," Jake nodded. "Henderson knows it too. He's trying to force us into a corner, give up the slander claims against him, or lose the land we need to keep the ranch viable. Carlos, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly straightened. "The survey markers," he said. "My father, before he passed, he helped reset them after the flood of '65. He kept records, drawings of exactly where they placed them." "In the old ledgers?" Sarah asked, remembering the careful notes she'd seen while organizing the office. "No, in his personal journal. I still have it at home." Carlos's eyes lit up. He was meticulous about such things. Said a man's word and a land's boundaries should both be clear as mountain streams. Jake's expression shifted from worry to determined. "Hope, get that journal, Carlos. Pete, ride into town and tell Judge Wilson we need to see him, unofficially. Miguel, start gathering statements from the older ranchers who remember where those boundaries have always been." As the men dispersed to their tasks, Sarah felt another kind of movement. Not the baby this time, but the pieces of a plan falling into place. "Mrs. Tanner," she called, "would you help me write some letters? There are some people in Boston who need to understand exactly what kind of man Thomas Henderson really is." The housekeeper's smile was sharp as a winter wind. "Thought you'd never ask, dear." Through the window, Sarah watched the ranch hands going about their duties with renewed purpose. Each one had a role to play in this fight, not just for land or reputation, but for the principle of standing together against bullies and lies. Jake moved behind her, his presence solid and reassuring. "You should be resting." "I've rested." "Enough," she replied, though she let him guide her to a comfortable chair. "Besides, this is more important than my feet being elevated." He knelt beside her, taking her hands in his. "Nothing's more important than you and the little one being safe." The tenderness in his voice made her throat tight. "Jake, when this is over," he said quietly, "when we've won this fight, because we will win it, I'd like to ask you something. Something important." Sarah's heart skipped, then settled into a rhythm as steady as prairie wind. "Yes, I haven't asked." Yet he smiled. "I know." She squeezed his hands, "but the answer will be yes." Their eyes met and held, the moment stretching between them like a ribbon of pure gold. Then the sound of hoofbeats announced Carlos's return with his father's journal, and they both turned to face the tasks ahead. The battle lines were drawn, but this time Sarah knew with bone-deep certainty she was on the right side, with the right people, and together they would prevail. Dr. Wilson's expression was grave as he completed his examination. "The baby's shifted," he said, packing away his stethoscope. "And your blood pressure is higher than I'd like, Miss Matthews." Sarah sat propped up in bed, her hands protectively, cradling her swollen belly. Outside her window, she could hear the busy sounds of the ranch, preparing for tomorrow's court hearing. "How much time?" she asked. "A week, maybe less." The doctor sighed. "Normally, I'd insist on complete bed rest at my clinic in town, but given the circumstances, I'm not leaving the ranch," Sarah said firmly. "Not now." Jake, who had been standing silently by the door, stepped forward. "Sarah!" "No." She met his worried gaze. "This is my home now. Our home. I won't let them drive me away when we're so close to resolving everything." Dr. Wilson pulled a paper from his bag. "I'll leave strict instructions with Mrs. Tanner. Any signs of labor, any at all, and you send for me immediately." He paused at the door. "I'll be at the hearing tomorrow. The judge should know the full impact of this stress on your condition." After he left, Jake sat carefully on the edge of Sarah's bed. "We could postpone," he suggested. "The Oregon buyers would understand. And let Thomas think he's won, that he can bully us into submission?" Sarah shook her head. "Carlos's father's journal proves the boundary markers were properly placed. The statements from neighboring ranchers confirm it. We have truth on our side. Truth won't matter much if something happens to you or the baby." Jake's voice was rough with emotion. Sarah reached for his hand, placed it over her belly where their futures grew together. "Do you feel that? That strength? That's not just my child in there anymore, Jake. This baby is part of the Triple C now, part of our family." And we Carsons don't back down from a fight. His eyes went wide at her use of the family name, then softened with a love so pure it made her breath catch. "Mrs. Tanner," he called. The housekeeper appeared so quickly she must have been hovering nearby. "Set up a cot in here for me tonight. I'm not leaving her alone." The evening passed in a blur of activity. Sarah could hear Miguel practicing his testimony about the boundary markers, Pete rehearsing the ranch's financial records that proved malicious interference, and Carlos reading aloud from his father's journal, each word a nail in Thomas's legal. Coffin. As darkness fell, Mrs. Tanner brought up a tray with mint tea and warm biscuits. "Letters came from Boston," she reported, laying several envelopes on the bedside table. "Looks like your old friends came through." Sarah opened the first letter, then smiled. "Caroline Morrison. She was in my finishing school class. She remembers Thomas quite well from his business trips east, especially his tendency to make promises he never intended to keep." "Character witnesses?" Jake asked, looking up from his own paperwork. "Better. Proof that Thomas's pattern of behavior extends well beyond Montana territory." Sarah patted the letters. "He's left quite a trail of broken promises and convenient memory lapses." Jake set aside his papers and moved to sit beside her. "You should rest. Tomorrow will be a long day." "I'll rest if you'll talk to me," she bargained. "Tell me about your dreams for the ranch, for our future." His smile was tender as summer. "Twilight. I see the north pasture full of our best breeding stock, the old bunkhouse converted into a proper school for ranch children, our children. Maybe a garden, like Martha's but bigger, with a section just for flowers, because some things should exist purely for beauty." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "It sounds perfect." "It will be." He brushed a kiss across her forehead. "But first, we have to win this fight. We will," she said with quiet certainty, "because we're not just fighting for land or reputation. We're fighting for home, for family, for the right to build something true and lasting." Through her window she could see the ranch's weather vane turning slowly in the evening breeze, pointing north toward the disputed pastures. Tomorrow would bring its challenges, but tonight, surrounded by the love and determination of her chosen family, Sarah felt nothing but peace. The baby moved again, strong and sure, like a promise of things to come. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together, standing their ground on the soil that had nurtured 3 generations of Carsons and would, God willing, nurture many more to come. The town courthouse had never been so crowded. It seemed every rancher, shopkeeper, and curious onlooker from 3 counties had squeezed into the wooden building to witness the showdown between the Triple C and the Hendersons. Sarah sat beside Jake in the front row, ignoring the whispers that followed her like autumn leaves in the wind. Sheriff Mason stood by the door, his badge catching the morning light. He'd positioned himself carefully between the Carson ranch hands and Thomas's supporters, ready for trouble but hoping it wouldn't come. Judge Wilson entered, his face as weathered as the law books he carried. "Before we begin these proceedings," he announced, "I want it clear that this is about property boundaries and business practices. Anyone looking to air personal grievances can take them elsewhere." Sarah felt a sharp pain in her abdomen, but forced herself to remain still. She wouldn't give Thomas the satisfaction of seeing her weakness. Jake must have sensed her distress because his hand found hers, warm and steadying. Thomas's lawyer rose first, all polished words and city manners. He spoke of traditional boundaries, of gentlemen's agreements allegedly broken, of a respected family's reputation tarnished by baseless accusations. Then came the surprise. Mrs. Henderson herself taking the stand, her voice trembling with well-practiced emotion as she described her son's suffering, his flight east to escape scandal, the damage to their family name. "And did you receive a letter from Miss Matthews before the wedding?" Jake's lawyer asked during cross-examination. "A letter explaining her condition." That is," Mrs. Henderson's compose cracked slightly. "There may have been some correspondence. A simple yes or no, Mrs. Henderson." The silence stretched thin as prairie grass in drought. Finally, barely audible, "Yes." A murmur ran through the courthouse. Thomas half rose from his seat, face flushed, but his lawyer pulled him back down. The morning wore on. Miguel presented. The evidence of business interference, cancelled contracts, withdrawn agreements, all tied to Thomas's family's influence. Pete produced the ranch's financial records, showing the pattern of targeted pressure. Then Carlos took the stand, his father's journal open in his hands. His voice grew stronger as he read the detailed descriptions of the boundary markers, the precise measurements, the witnesses present when they were placed. "And these other signatures?" Jake's lawyer asked. "The ones witnessing the placement?" "See," Carlos nodded. "Including Mr. Henderson's father, Thomas's grandfather. He agreed to these boundaries himself." Another ripple through the crowd. Judge Wilson leaned forward, examining the journal's yellowed pages. Sarah felt another pain, stronger this time. She must have made some small sound because Mrs. Tanner, sitting behind her, leaned forward in concern. "Just a few more minutes," Sarah whispered, but the pain was spreading, becoming harder to ignore. Jake was on his feet now, presenting the letters from Boston. Thomas's face grew paler with each one read aloud, evidence of his pattern of behavior, his promises to other women, his convenient disappearances when consequences loomed. "Your Honor," Thomas's lawyer tried to intervene, "these personal matters have no bearing. They speak to character." Judge Wilson cut him off. "And character speaks to credibility." He turned to Mrs. Henderson. "You testified earlier about your son's reputation. Care to revise that statement?" But before she could answer, Sarah couldn't suppress a gasp of pain. Jake turned immediately, his face draining of color as he saw her condition. "Sarah, the baby," she managed. "It's coming." The courthouse erupted in chaos. Dr. Wilson pushed through the crowd, Sheriff Mason cleared a path to the door, and Mrs. Tanner was already sending Pete for the wagon. "Wait!" Sarah gripped Jake's arm as he tried to lift her. "The judgment." Judge Wilson stood. "Given the evidence presented, particularly the surveyor's journal and witness testimonies, I find no merit in the boundary dispute. The land remains with the Triple C Ranch." He paused, looking directly at Thomas. "As for the other matters of slander and business interference, I strongly suggest the Hendersons withdraw their complaints immediately." "Your Honor," Thomas began, but his mother grabbed his arm, shaking her head. Finally, she had reached her limit. Sarah barely registered their defeat. Another contraction gripped her, and this time she couldn't hold back a cry of pain. "Hang on, love," Jake whispered, lifting her easily in his arms. "Our family's waiting for us," as he carried her from the courthouse into the bright Montana. Morning, Sarah caught a glimpse of Thomas watching them, not with anger now, but with something that might have been regret. He had lost far more than a land dispute today. He had lost the chance to be part of something real, something true. But Sarah had found it, and as another contraction came, she held tight to Jake and knew that their greatest challenge and greatest joy was just beginning. The doctor's house filled with the cry of a newborn just as the sun began to set. After hours of labor, Sarah lay exhausted but triumphant, cradling her daughter while Jake hovered nearby, his eyes wide with wonder. "She's perfect," Dr. Wilson announced, wrapping the infant in a soft blanket Mrs. Tanner had quilted during Sarah's bed rest. "Strong lungs, good color. She's a fighter just like her mama." The baby had Sarah's dark hair and delicate features, but when she opened her eyes, they were a striking sage green that made Jake catch his breath. "Look at that," Mrs. Tanner said softly. "Those are Martha's eyes, sure as sunrise." Outside, the gathered ranch hands let out a cheer when Pete emerged to announce the news. Their celebration drew townspeople from their homes and shops, curiosity overcoming their previous judgment. "A girl?" Carlos's wife Maria asked, pressing a small silver cross into Jake's hand. "May I see her? In my village, we believe a baby. Girl brings special blessings." To everyone's surprise, it was Mrs. Henderson who spoke next. She had been walking past, perhaps heading home from the courthouse, and now stood hesitating at the doctor's gate. Is the child, are they both well? She asked quietly. Jake studied her for a moment, then nodded. Would you like to see them? Sarah was dozing when they entered, but she woke at the sound of footsteps. Her eyes widened slightly at the sight of Mrs. Henderson, but the peace of new motherhood had left no room for anger or resentment. She's beautiful, Mrs. Henderson whispered, watching the baby nurse. I should have done things differently. Should have been braver, like you. There's still time, Sarah said gently. For new beginnings. The older woman touched the baby's soft cheek with a trembling finger. Thomas has decided to stay east. Perhaps that's best for everyone. Perhaps, Jake agreed, but without rancor. Their victory was too complete, too joyful, to leave room for bitterness. Mrs. Henderson reached into her reticule and withdrew an envelope. I kept your letter, the one you wrote Thomas. I thought your daughter might want to read it someday, to know how fiercely her mother fought for her right from the start. Sarah took the envelope, feeling the weight of past choices and future possibilities in its creased pages. Thank you. After Mrs. Henderson left, others began to drift in. Maria with her silver cross, the Reverend's wife bringing a basket of fresh bread, ranch hands awkwardly offering small gifts and big smiles. The room slowly filled with the warmth of community healing itself. What will you name her? Mrs. Tanner asked, expertly settling the baby after her meal. Sarah looked at Jake, who had barely left her side. They had discussed this during her bed rest, planning for a future they could now fully embrace. Martha Rose, Sarah said softly, for the woman who made this ranch a home, and for the flowers she planted that bloom even in difficult soil. Jake's eyes glistened as he took his daughter, their daughter, into his arms. Martha Rose Carson, he said, making it official. Welcome home, little one. Carson? Sarah asked, her heart skipping. Jake smiled that gentle smile she'd grown to love. Well, I was hoping, that is, I know this isn't the most romantic moment, but he carefully passed the baby to Mrs. Tanner and knelt beside Sarah's bed. I had a whole speech planned, but watching you today, your strength, your grace, your ability to offer forgiveness to those who wronged you, I can't wait another minute. Sarah Matthews, will you marry me? Make this family official? Sarah reached for his hand, remembering that first touch when he helped her onto his horse all those months ago. Yes, she whispered, 1,000 times yes. The baby chose that moment to let out a demanding cry, making everyone laugh. Mrs. Tanner handed her back to Sarah, and Jake gathered them both in his arms, careful of Sarah's exhaustion, but unable to contain his joy. A family, he murmured, into Sarah's hair, a real family. Outside, the sun set over the Montana mountains, painting the sky in colors of promise. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. A wedding to plan, a ranch to run, a child to raise. But tonight, in this room filled with the love of their chosen family and the first cries of new life, everything was exactly as it should be. 1 week after Martha Rose's birth, the ranch hosted a celebration that would be talked about for years to come. Not just a christening, but a wedding too. Sarah and Jake saw no reason to wait once their hearts were decided. The ceremony took place in Martha's rose garden, now blooming more vigorously than ever before. Sarah wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Tanner and Maria had worked on secretly during her bed rest, and Jake wore his best suit with a rose from his late wife's bushes in his lapel. A tribute, he'd explained to Sarah that morning, to the past that brought us to this moment. The baby slept peacefully in Mrs. Tanner's arms as Reverend Parker performed the ceremony. His wife sat in the front row, her eyes damp with tears of genuine joy, her earlier judgment transformed by the undeniable love before her. Judge Wilson stood as witness, the marriage license crisp and official in his hands. But it was the other document he'd brought that caused the most talk. Adoption papers, legally making Martha Rose Jake's daughter in the eyes of the law, though she'd been his in heart since before her birth. "The Triple C has a future now," Pete remarked to Miguel as they watched Jake kiss his bride. "A real future." Sarah and Jake exchanged their vows beneath an arch of roses, their words simple but profound. They spoke of second chances and found family, of love that grows stronger through adversity, of building something lasting on foundations of truth and trust. As Jake slipped the ring on her finger, his mother's ring worn smooth by generations of Carson women, Sarah felt the last pieces of her old life fall away, replaced by something far more precious than social standing or family connections. She had found her true home, not in grand Boston parlors or social expectations, but here on the Montana prairie, where love grew as wild and true as summer roses. Autumn painted the Triple C in shades of gold and amber as Martha Rose took her. First tentative steps across the ranch house porch. Jake caught her before she could stumble, his weathered hands gentle around her tiny waist. "She's got Carson determination," Mrs. Tanner observed, watching from her rocking chair where she was mending shirts. "Won't be long before she's following. You on rounds, Jake?" Sarah paused in her account-keeping to watch her family. The Oregon contracts had proved even more profitable than expected, allowing them to hire 2 new hands and begin repairs on the old bunkhouse. Soon it would be a proper schoolroom ready for Martha Rose and the other ranch children. "We got word from the Henderson place," Pete reported, coming up from the barn. "Mrs. Henderson's selling. Says she's moving east to be closer to Thomas." Jake nodded, unsurprised. Time for new blood on that land. Young Roberts and his wife are looking to start ranching. Might be good neighbors. "Better than good," Sarah added. "Mary Roberts asked if I'd help her set up a lending library in town. Says every proper community needs books as well as cattle." The baby squealed with delight as Carlos's youngest daughter made faces at her through the porch railing. The ranch had become a gathering place for families, the old divisions of status and background fading like morning mist under the Montana sun. "Mama! Papa!" Martha Rose's first real words rang out clear as a bell, making everyone freeze in wonder. Jake scooped up his daughter, pride shining in his eyes. "That's right, little one, we're right here. Always will be." Sarah joined them, her heart full to bursting. This was what she'd been seeking all along, not just a marriage, but a true partnership, not just a home, but a legacy of love and acceptance to pass on to their child. 1 year to the day after Sarah first fled from the chapel in her ruined wedding dress, she stood in the Triple C's barn watching Jake design a new brand. The traditional C remained, but now it incorporated a delicate M and R for Martha Rose. "For all the Carson children to come," Jake explained, his eyes twinkling. "Speaking of which," Sarah smiled, touching her belly where their second miracle was just beginning to show. The ranch doctor had confirmed it last week, and the news had spread through the ranch like wildfire, bringing joy to every face. Martha Rose toddled between them, her dark curls bouncing, sage-green eyes bright with curiosity. She reached for the branding iron design, and Jake lifted her up to see. "Your legacy too, little one," he said softly. "A place where truth matters more than appearances, where family is defined by love rather than blood." Through the barn door, Sarah could see the ranch stretching out under the Montana sky. The schoolroom was nearly finished. Roses bloomed in the garden, and the sound of children's laughter mixed with the everyday sounds of ranch work. She had found her truth here, in this place where her heart had always been meant to dwell, not as a mail-order bride seeking respectability, but as a woman who had chosen love, chosen family, chosen her own path. The new wedding ring gleamed on Sarah's finger as she stood before the same chapel where her dreams had once shattered. This time, though, she wasn't alone. Jake stood beside her, Martha Rose balanced on his hip, while their unborn child stirred beneath her heart. Together, they watched young Mary Roberts walk down the aisle, her eyes shining with the same hope Sarah had once carried. But this bride's dreams were built on stronger foundations: truth acceptance, and the support of a community that had learned valuable lessons about judgment and second chances. "Remember when you found me on that road?" Sarah whispered to Jake as the ceremony proceeded. "Best detour I ever took," he replied, squeezing her hand. Mrs. Tanner dabbed at her eyes from the pew behind them. Pete and Miguel sat with their families nearby, while Carlos's children helped scatter rose petals, blooms from the garden where 2 stories of love had taken root. Martha Rose reached for one of the floating petals, her sage-green eyes bright with wonder. "Pretty," she declared, showing it to her parents. "Yes, little one," Sarah agreed, looking at her family, at their home, at the life they'd built together. "Everything is beautiful when you're exactly where you're meant to be."